In the year 1569, a Flemish cartographer named Gerardus Mercator unveiled a world map that would quietly reshape how humanity sees the planet. At first glance, it looked revolutionary, clean, precise, scientific. But there was a problem. Greenland appeared almost as large as Africa, and no one seemed to question it. Why would a landmass covered in ice rival an entire continent filled with deserts, jungles, and civilizations? And more importantly, how did this become the standard way of seeing the world? Within decades, this projection spread across Europe, then across empires, then into classrooms, atlases, textbooks, globes. Billions of people would grow up looking at this version of reality. But what if that version wasn't neutral? What if it quietly distorted more than just geography? Because when you look closer, the numbers don't add up. Africa is actually about 14 times larger than Greenland. 14. Yet on many maps, they look nearly equal. And this is where things get strange. Because Gerardus Mercator never intended his map to represent size accurately. His projection was designed for navigation, for sailors crossing long distances. It preserved angles, not proportions. It helped ships move efficiently across oceans. But it was never meant to define how the world looks. So why did it become the dominant image of Earth? Why did a tool designed for navigation become a tool for perception? And more importantly, who benefited from that shift? At first, this looks like a simple misunderstanding, a technical limitation, an innocent choice. But what most people miss is how long this mistake persisted. Even after better projections were developed, even after the distortion was widely understood, even after scholars pointed out the inaccuracies, the same map remained. And that raises a deeper question. If the error was known, why wasn't it corrected? Because when you overlay political history onto cartography, a pattern begins to emerge. During the height of European expansion, when empires were spreading across continents, this distorted map became widespread. On it, Europe appeared larger than it really is. North America stretched wider, while regions near the equator, Africa, South America, parts of Asia, appeared compressed, smaller, less dominant. Coincidence? Some historians argue it is, that it's simply a side effect of projection math. But there is another way to look at this. Maps don't just show reality, they shape it. They influence how people think about power, importance, and scale. If a region looks bigger, it feels bigger, more significant, more central. And if another region looks smaller, it becomes easier to overlook, easier to undervalue, easier to control. And this is where the story moves beyond one map. Because once you start examining historical maps, you begin to notice something unsettling. They are not consistent, not just in style, but in structure. Some maps show entire landmasses that don't appear in others. Some depict coastlines that don't match modern geography. Others include territories that seem misplaced or missing. At first, these differences are explained as errors, limited technology, incomplete exploration. But what happened next is almost never explained. Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, as global empires solidified their control, maps became more standardized, more uniform, more official. Governments, institutions, and publishers began producing maps at scale. And suddenly, variation disappeared. One version of the world replaced all others. But here's the question no one asks. What happened to the maps that didn't match? Were they corrected or were they removed? Because when you dig into archives, you find fragments, older maps that don't align with the standardized versions, maps that show cities in different locations, trade routes that don't make sense today, regions labeled with names that no longer exist. And this is where things get even more interesting. Because cartography isn't just about geography, it's about control. Controlling borders, controlling resources, controlling how people understand the world around them. If you can define the map, you can define reality. Think about it. Borders on a map determine nations. Nations determine laws. Laws determine power. So what happens if the map itself is flawed, or worse, intentionally altered? Now, to be clear, there is no single piece of evidence that proves a coordinated effort to manipulate maps. But the pattern raises questions. Why did one projection dominate globally despite its known distortions? Why were alternative representations rarely taught? Why do certain historical maps show inconsistencies that are never fully addressed? And why does questioning this feel uncomfortable? Because most people trust maps. They feel objective, scientific, authoritative. But maps are created by people, and people operate within systems that have incentives, motives, priorities, and sometimes blind spots. At first, this all seems distant, a historical curiosity, something that doesn't affect us anymore. But what most people miss is how these perceptions carry forward. Even today, the way we visualize the world influences global narratives. Which countries feel powerful? Which regions feel peripheral? Which histories are remembered? And which are forgotten? And this is where the deeper layer begins to reveal itself. Because the issue isn't just distortion, it's repetition. The same patterns appearing again and again across different maps, different eras, different systems, as if something beneath the surface is shaping them. Not always intentionally, not always obviously, but consistently. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. So the real question isn't whether old maps were wrong. The real question is, what else might they have been shaping without us realizing it? And more importantly, what happens when we finally start questioning them? In 1730, a French cartographer named Guillaume Delisle published what was considered one of the most accurate maps of its time. It was praised for its precision. Scholars admired it. Governments trusted it. But there was something unusual hidden inside it. Entire regions appeared uncertain. Some areas were marked with faint outlines. Others were labeled with notes instead of borders. Phrases like unknown lands or reported by travelers quietly filled the edges. At first this seems honest, a map admitting its limits. But then something changes. Just decades later, maps begin to lose that uncertainty. The blank spaces disappear. The notes vanish. The hesitation is gone. Everything becomes defined. Clean borders, clear territories, confident lines. And this is where things get strange. Because the actual exploration of many of these regions hadn't significantly improved. Large parts of Africa, Antarctica, and the interiors of continents were still largely unmapped. So how did uncertainty turn into certainty so quickly? Some historians argue it was a matter of progress. Better instruments, more expeditions, improved calculations. But there is another way to look at this. Maps didn't just reflect discovery, they began to reflect authority. Because during this period, empires weren't just exploring the world, they were dividing it, claiming it, owning it, and ownership requires definition. You cannot control a territory that is labeled unknown, but once it has a border, once it has a name, once it appears fixed on a map, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes real. And this is where cartography shifts from observation to construction. Because a line drawn on a map is not just a line, it's a decision. Who belongs where? Who controls what counts, and what doesn't. At first, this looks like organization, a necessary step in building nations. But what most people miss is how arbitrary many of these decisions were. In Africa, for example, borders were often drawn with straight lines, perfectly straight, cutting across rivers, mountains, and entire cultural regions. Why? Because those lines weren't drawn on the ground. They were drawn in rooms, thousands of kilometers away. During meetings like the Berlin Conference, European powers divided entire continents among themselves. No local input, no understanding of existing systems, just lines on paper. And those lines still exist today. Think about that. Modern conflicts, national identities, economic struggles, all influenced by decisions made on maps over a century ago. And this is where the pattern becomes harder to ignore. Maps don't just describe the world, they actively reshape it. But it goes deeper. Because beyond borders, maps also control visibility. What gets included? What gets excluded? What is emphasized? And what is quietly removed? For example, older maps often included detailed trade routes, paths connecting cities across vast distances. Some of these routes are well documented, like the Silk Road, but others are less clear. They appear on maps, then disappear, without explanation. Were they abandoned, or redefined, or simply forgotten? And this is where things become even more subtle, because sometimes what's missing matters more than what's shown. Entire settlements, structures, even cities that appear in older cartographic records don't always appear in later ones. At first, this is explained as error, misreporting, traveler exaggeration. But when patterns repeat across multiple independent maps, it becomes harder to dismiss. And this raises a difficult question. How much of history is shaped by what is preserved? And how much by what is quietly removed? Because maps are selective. They have to be. You cannot include everything, but selection introduces bias. And bias, over time, becomes narrative. And narrative becomes belief. And belief becomes reality. Now, consider this. If a city disappears from maps, but remains physically present, what happens? Eventually, it fades from awareness, from records, from memory, until it becomes something else, a rumor, a myth, a mystery. And this is where the emotional layer begins to surface, because behind every erased line, every missing name, there is loss. Not always dramatic, not always visible, but real. Communities disconnected from their past, histories that no longer have a place, voices that were never recorded. And this is not always intentional. Sometimes it's the result of shifting priorities. Sometimes it's political, sometimes economic. But the outcome is the same. A simplified version of the world replaces a complex one, and most people never notice, because they only ever see the final version, the clean map, the official borders, the standardized names. But what most people miss is the process behind it, the revisions, the edits, the decisions, and who was making them. Because when you follow that trail, a pattern begins to emerge. Maps tend to align with power, with dominant narratives, with those who have the resources to produce and distribute them. And this is where the hidden motive starts to take shape. Not as a conspiracy, but as a system where information flows in one direction, from authority to the public, rarely the other way around. And in that system, questioning becomes difficult. Not because it's forbidden, but because it's unfamiliar. Maps feel final, complete, objective. So we don't question them, we accept them. But what happens when you step outside that acceptance? When you compare versions, when you look at older records, when you notice inconsistencies? That's when the cracks begin to show, small at first. A coastline that doesn't match, a region that shifts, a name that disappears. But then you start asking, how many of these changes were corrections, and how many were choices? And this is where things connect to something larger, because the same pattern appears in other systems, in textbooks, in timelines, in how history itself is presented, a process of refinement, of simplification, of standardization, until complexity is reduced to something easier to understand, but also easier to control. And once you see that pattern in maps, you start to see it everywhere, which leads to a deeper, more unsettling question. If maps have been shaping reality for centuries, then what version of reality are we living in now? And how much of it have we never thought to question? In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis presented a map unlike anything seen before. It showed parts of Europe, Africa, and South America with surprising accuracy. But that wasn't what made it unusual. What caught attention was what appeared at the bottom: a landmass, drawn in a way that, centuries later, some would compare to Antarctica. But Antarctica wouldn't be officially discovered until 1820, over 300 years later. So how did this map include something that, according to conventional history, wasn't known? At first, this seems like coincidence, a misinterpretation. Some historians argue that the southern landmass is simply a distorted extension of South America, a cartographic error. But others point out details that are harder to ignore. The coastline appears ice-free, outlined, structured, as if it had been observed, not imagined. And this is where things get complicated, because Piri Reis didn't claim to have discovered these lands himself. In his own notes, he wrote that his map was compiled from older sources. Multiple maps, some ancient, some, according to him, dating back to earlier civilizations. And this is where the pattern deepens, because this isn't the only map with anomalies. There are others. The Orontius Phineas World Map shows a southern continent in remarkable detail. The Mercator 1569 World Map includes landmasses that seem unusually structured for their time. Even earlier maps, fragments, sketches, partial records, hint at geographic knowledge that doesn't fully align with the official timeline. At first, each case can be explained individually. An error here, a coincidence there, a misreading somewhere else. But when viewed together, they begin to form a pattern suggesting that historical knowledge may not have developed in a straight line, but in fragments, lost, recovered, reinterpreted, and sometimes overwritten. Because if these maps were based on older sources, then the question becomes, where did those sources come from? Who created them? And why do so few of them remain? Some historians argue that ancient civilizations had more advanced geographical knowledge than we assume, that trade networks, exploration, and accumulated observations allowed for surprisingly accurate mapping. Others suggest something more complex. That knowledge was not just built, but inherited, passed down from earlier systems that no longer exist in full. And this is where things become difficult to verify, because the further back you go, the fewer records remain, and the more those records rely on interpretation, translation, reconstruction, which introduces uncertainty, but also possibility. And this is where the story shifts from maps to memory. Because maps are not just physical objects. They are records of what a society knows, or believes it knows. So when a map includes something unexpected, it raises a deeper question. Is it wrong? Or is it remembering something we've forgotten? And this is where things get even more subtle. Because over time, knowledge doesn't just disappear. It gets filtered, adjusted, standardized, until only certain versions remain, and those versions become official. Everything else becomes questionable, alternative, or dismissed. At first, this seems necessary, a way to maintain accuracy, consistency, clarity. But what most people miss is the trade-off, because standardization removes variation, and variation is where anomalies live, the very anomalies that might challenge existing narratives, or expand them, or complicate them. And this is where the emotional undercurrent deepens, because if knowledge has been filtered, then something has been lost. Not necessarily hidden, not necessarily erased intentionally, but reduced, simplified, compressed into something easier to manage and easier to teach, but perhaps less complete. Now consider this in a modern context. Today maps are more precise than ever. Satellite imagery, GPS systems, real-time updates. Everything appears exact, measured, verified. But even now, maps are still selective. Digital platforms decide what to display, what to label, what to prioritize. Some locations are detailed, others are blurred. Some names are highlighted, others are absent. And this is where the connection between past and present becomes clear. The tools have changed, but the function remains the same. Maps still shape perception, still guide attention, still define what feels real and what doesn't. So when you look at an old map now, it's no longer just a historical artifact. It becomes a question, a possibility, a glimpse into how people once understood the world, or how they were taught to understand it. And this is where everything begins to converge. The distorted projections, the shifting borders, the disappearing routes, the unexplained landmasses. Individually, they can be explained, but together, they suggest something larger, not a single hidden truth, but a system. A system where knowledge evolves, but also narrows, where information expands, but is also curated, where maps don't just reflect reality, they participate in building it. And once you start to see that, you begin to question more than just maps. You begin to question frameworks, assumptions, defaults, what you were shown, and what you were never shown. And this leads to a final unsettling realization. Maybe the issue was never that old maps were wrong. Maybe the issue is that we assumed modern ones are completely right. Because if history has shown anything, it's that every generation believes its version is the most accurate, until the next one comes along and changes it. So the real question isn't whether maps can be trusted. It's this: what version of the world are we looking at right now that future generations will quietly realize was incomplete? And when that moment comes, what will they see that we never thought to question?